In the oldest layers beneath the first cities, long before temples rose or kingdoms claimed the rivers, ancient scribes recorded quiet details about a world that no longer exists. Their clay tablets do not speak in myths or legends. They speak in calm, steady lines observations pressed into wet clay by people who did not yet know how extraordinary their surroundings were. They described kings who walked beneath unmoving suns, fields where shadows hesitated, visitors who never ate, lights that travelled without flame, and structures that rose in silence and vanished by dusk. These records come from a time before the flood traditions, before the known dynasties, before writing became a tool of power. They form a forgotten archive of moments that early people accepted without fear or explanation. Tonight, we follow these quiet fragments and trace the outlines of a world remembered only in clay, the world that existed when the gods walked among kings. The king who claimed the sky stood still. The oldest tablets found beneath the ruins of ancient Eridu describe a ruler named Alzu, remembered by early scribes as the king who lived during a quiet and unusually stable age. Archaeologists date these tablets to around 10,400 BCE, a period known for heavy silt deposits that hint at slow-moving flood cycles. The writing on these clay pieces is simple. It avoids praise and avoids mythic language. It states events as if someone wanted the record to survive without emotion. One line says, "The sun paused above the eastern ridge on the day he took the throne." The scribe does not explain what this meant. It is written the same way one would record the number of goats born in a season. The tablets mention Alzu's appearance only once, describing his hair as dark as reed shadows. More important to the writers were the beings they called the ones who crossed. They appear in several fragments, with no marks that associate them with known gods or spirits. Instead, they stand beside rulers in quiet moments. One tablet discovered at Abu Sharain lists their arrivals with simple vertical tallies. The marks look more like direct witness notes than religious notation. Researchers noted that the spacing between the tallies suggests equal intervals, which some have compared to lunar cycles, though the original text does not say this. Archaeologists found long, thin, stylus impressions on tablets from this same layer. Some believe they were carved with sharpened bone, but the grooves appear unusually smooth. A description from Tel Abu Salabik refers to a meeting at the Western Marsh. It states, "They stood without breath. The king lowered his eyes. They carried no blades. The tone is calm. There is no warning, no celebration." The writer seems to have recorded the event as if it were part of daily life. Another fragment found in the Zagros foothills mentions 3 points that moved with choice. The scribe observed these lights drifting above the river at dusk. The record says they settled near the marsh village and stayed until morning. No meanings are assigned to them. No ritual appears in the text. The description resembles a weather observation more than a myth. A similar detail appears in a broken stele from northern Syria, dated to around 9,800 BCE, which speaks of travellers from the high cold who entered settlements and spoke with rulers. This phrase later reappears in Hittite commentaries, suggesting that the memory persisted for thousands of years. Several early Sumerian word lists found in the ruins of Uruk contain titles that do not appear in later administrative texts. One is Nia Enlil, translated by some as shadow that advises. Another, Saru Mel, later becomes a term for celestial messengers, but these early examples do not present them as divine. A Kish tablet has a broken line saying, "He taught the king the number that measures the deep." The tablet gives no clue about what this number was. It simply presents it as a normal exchange. One tablet from 1,933 excavations describes a night when the Euphrates shifted direction without storm or wind. The people gathered on higher ground and watched the waters bend. The final line says, "The king spoke with the crosses. He asked nothing." It is unclear whether this moment marked a natural shift in the riverbed or something else. The absence of emotion in the text stands out. Later, Mesopotamian writing often contained metaphors, fear, or praise. Here, there is only observation. Seals discovered near Lhasa depict tall figures with narrow headpieces standing beside kings. The figures are slightly larger, though their proportions remain human. They wear robes marked by 3 vertical lines on the chest. Samuel Kramer noted in a 1949 report that these symbols never appear again in known Sumerian iconography. One seal shows Alzu raising a cup toward them. The caption states, "He received the measure of years." Some researchers think this refers to a promise of long rule. Others believe it refers to instruction in a system of time. The Sumerian king list, in its oldest form, records Alzu's reign as short as the passing shadow, only 15 years. Yet a second tablet from the same site says he ruled for 57 seasons. The difference remains unexplained. Some scholars argue the short number may reflect political memory, while the longer one might represent ceremonial cycles or a pre-flood method of counting. Another fragment claims, "When they walked, the hours thickened." This could refer to altered time perception or symbolic phrasing. The scribes made no attempt to clarify. In the lower levels of the Nippur archive, a record mentions lights that hovered above the king's house during the night. The writer says, "They hung like lamps carried by no hands." The next morning, circular impressions appeared in the soil near the granaries. Several texts describe these hollows as smooth, round, and pressed into the ground. When modern geologists examined samples from these areas, they found compacted clay, the kind formed under sudden heat or heavy pressure. No known tools from that period could produce such shapes. Another tablet in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum states that the advisors from the sky taught Alzu to divide land by a grid of 12. Mesopotamian fields later used a 12-part division system, but this text places the method far earlier than any known survey practices. An Assyrian commentary from 700 BCE quotes an older line. "The first measure came from those who fell from the high track." This suggests that later cultures preserved fragments of these early accounts long after the names had changed. A fragment from an early hymn describes the visitors with minimal detail. It says, "They walked with quiet steps. They left no prints." The hymn mentions a soft hum in the reeds during their approach. Archaeologists later found that reed beds can vibrate when exposed to low-frequency sound. Some researchers propose natural explanations. Others argue that the uniform mention of sound across distant sites suggests a shared memory rather than chance. Another clay piece describes a night when Alzu followed the crosses into the western dunes. It says, "The people watched the lights moving with him." The final line reads, "He did not return before the water came." This is one of the earliest regional references to a flood. The silt layer above these tablets supports the idea that a large water event occurred. The account does not describe chaos or panic. It simply ends once the water arrives. Records of Alzu end after this. No later tablets mention his return. Later scribes refer to him only as the king who walked with those above. The tone of all these early texts remains consistent. It does not praise, it does not warn, it only records. The fragments remain debated among historians, archaeologists, and researchers who study pre-flood traditions. Some say the crossers were travelers from distant lands. Others think they represent symbolic figures tied to celestial events. Some propose that they were rulers of an older forgotten group. The tablets themselves do not provide answers. They state what people saw and leave the meaning open. The writing stops as quietly as it begins. The king walks. The lights pause. The river curves. The people watch. The record ends. The city, built with no shadows. In the lower silts of the western Euphrates plain, archaeologists uncovered the scattered remains of a settlement older than any known Sumerian foundation. The tablets found nearby call it Ubara, a place described calmly as the wide court where noon left no mark. The phrasing puzzled researchers from the moment it was translated, because nothing in the region's geography could erase shadows. Yet the early scribes repeated the description without decoration. One fragment from a collapsed mud brick house states, "At midday the ground shone, and the lines of men and stones did not fall." There is no added meaning. The writer simply noted what he believed he saw. The ground around the ruins carries a thin layer of white mineral crust, unlike the darker soil that surrounds most early villages. Geologists examining samples noted a high concentration of silica fused into hardened patches, as though heat once swept across sections of the settlement. The fusion does not match natural fire patterns. Some patches form long, narrow strips, suggesting tools or structured movement rather than random burning. A field report written in 1974 by a survey team documented whether these strips aligned to the cardinal directions. They did not. Instead, many formed shallow curves, bending slightly toward a point now eroded by wind and time. Near the center of the site stood the remains of a platform made from stone foreign to this part of Mesopotamia. The blocks contained flecks of a pale green mineral found only in distant mountain ranges. One broken inscription mentions slabs carried from the teeth of the high rock. The phrase appears literal rather than symbolic. The presence of these stones raises questions about transport. No clear dragging routes have been traced. The surrounding terrain shows no deep grooves or trails that large cargo would normally leave. Instead, the soil is lightly disturbed, as if smaller loads were moved repeatedly over long periods. A collection of tablets from the site describes Ubara as a place set aside for gatherings between kings and unnamed advisors. The words do not match the titles given to figures in other regions. Here they are called the ciphers, a term not found in later Mesopotamian records. A short text on a broken clay roll says, "They spoke with no motion of mouth. Their words rested in the air until taken." The line is plain. It does not attempt to explain the method of communication. It only describes the experience of the listener. Some researchers suggest this may refer to silent gestures or coded signals. Others believe it marks a type of instruction no longer understood. Another tablet from Ubara records that the settlement's builders shaped the streets according to a pattern meant to hold the upper light. The writer does not define this light. Instead, he notes that the streets were placed so that the rising path of the morning star guided the first cut of the stone. When astronomers traced the described alignment, they found that around 10,200 BCE, the morning star, identified as Venus, rose at an angle that would indeed align with two of the preserved foundations. This match is not exact, yet it suggests the builders used careful observation rather than guesswork. A series of narrow foundations extend outward from the site center like spokes. They appear evenly spaced, though erosion has made several difficult to measure. A tablet found, half buried, near the longest spoke states, the lines pointed to the watchers in the high dark. The scribe does not specify who the watchers were. Some scholars consider that the phrase may refer to stars or distant mountains. Others note that the wording resembles descriptions found in older layers beneath Uruk, where early astronomers recorded night sky positions in short, detached statements. Excavations uncovered a row of rectangular pits arranged with unusual precision. Each pit contained fragments of polished stone sheets with faint circular etchings. The circles are not perfect. They tremble slightly around the edges, as though made by a steady but unfamiliar tool. One tablet states, the ciphers set these in place so that the day would balance with the night. Researchers studying the fragments found that several pairs of circles match solstice positions when placed upright. This suggests some form of timekeeping or seasonal tracking. However, the site offers no evidence of observatories known from later periods. Everything is smaller, simpler, yet built with intention. Another important find relates to the absence of shadows described in the tablets. Some researchers believe the phrase refers not to literal shadow disappearance, but to the reflective surface of the white mineral crust surrounding the buildings. Under strong light, the glare can blur the forms of objects, making shadows difficult to see at certain angles. A note found on a damaged tablet states, the ground shone brighter than men's feet. This could indicate a reflective coating, water pooling, or polished stone, though none of the usual materials were found. Samples show traces of crushed quartz mixed with clay, pressed thinly over the surface. No other early settlement in the region used this method. A few lines on one tablet mention that the buildings of Ubara stood thin under the sun. The surviving wall bases support this description, being unusually narrow and evenly cut. This design resembles none of the known Mesopotamian architectural traditions. Later builders preferred thick mud brick for insulation, but Ubara's walls suggest a different function entirely. The spacing of these foundations implies lightweight materials above them, now long vanished. Some archaeologists think wooden panels once rested there. Others believe the missing structures were made of reeds layered with hardened minerals. There is no definitive answer. One unusual tablet describes a gathering of rulers at Ubara under a fixed sky. The scribe wrote, "The air held firm, no wind passed." The ciphers placed their hands over the stones. Modern researchers have not found evidence for what this action meant. The text does not mention sound, movement, or reaction. It does, however, note that afterward the ground was smoother than before, as if pressed by a single weight. Soil samples show areas of compaction deeper than those in surrounding sites. The compaction does not match patterns left by simple foot traffic. An inscription found in the northern sector speaks of a tower without height. The phrase appears contradictory, yet scholars think it may refer to a platform hidden beneath the soil rather than a raised structure. The tablet states, "On it rested the chart of the crossings." The chart itself has not been found, but the phrase appears again in a later tablet from Nippur that describes early surveying tools. The repetition suggests Ubara served as a hub for mapping or tracking celestial objects. The lack of preserved instruments leaves this uncertain. A final fragment mentions that Ubara was abandoned when the air dimmed and the upper light changed its path. This line parallels other early references to shifting skies found in distant regions. It does not mention destruction or collapse. It only states that people left the place when the light no longer behaved as expected. The mineral crust around the site thickens above this occupational layer, suggesting a period of environmental change. Whether it was dust, heat, or something else remains unknown. The ruins of Ubara offer no clear story. They present only straight lines, faint etchings, reflective ground, and quiet tablets noting a settlement where noon left no trace underfoot. The scribes did not seek to explain these conditions. They simply recorded what they observed. The map of 12 paths, the tablets that scholars later grouped under the name the 12 Paths Archive, were uncovered deep within the storage layers of ancient Nippur. They were wrapped in brittle reed mats, preserved by silt, heat, and chance. Unlike ordinary temple records, these tablets did not track rations, livestock, or harvests. Instead, they presented a system of land division far older than the city-states that eventually shaped the region. The writing was calm and minimal. The scribe wrote, "The land was held by 12 long ways, each stretched from the first marker. No praise, no mythic tone, only a description of something that was treated as a practical framework. Archaeologists noted that the center of this system, the point from which all 12 paths radiated, was called the mound of the first measure. The mound's location is still debated. The tablets never describe it directly. They only say, from the mound, the first keeper set the strokes. These strokes, carved as short repeated lines, appear to be the earliest known units of measurement in the region. They are even, consistent, and carefully spaced. There are no numerals attached to them. The records refer to them simply as counts. A single tablet states 7 counts led from the mound to the edge of the path of east. The scribes did not try to explain the length. They expected the reader to know. Several tablets contain maps carved in faint, nearly parallel lines. The lines are too straight to be accidental. They cross the clay in narrow bands that fade toward the edges. Most scholars believe these depict the 12 paths themselves. One tablet reads, "The paths reached beyond the reed banks and into the open dry." This suggests the system extended across natural boundaries. Soil samples near suspected path sites show long compacted bands, only a few inches deep, but stretching for great distances. The bands are uniform in width, an unusual feature for early land division, which often used irregular markers like stones or natural features. The tablets mention a group known as the keepers of the measure. These individuals maintained each path. A line says, "The keepers walked their length at the dull moon." The dull moon likely refers to the dark nights before the new lunar cycle. Another tablet notes, "The keepers carried rods of equal cut." These rods appear in illustrations as straight staff-like objects. Their length is unclear, though fragments suggest they were used to verify straightness, much like later surveying tools. The rods were placed at points called mouths, simple boundary posts set at key transitions along the corridors. A distinctive passage describes how the keepers learned their craft. The scribe wrote, "The count was taught by those who watched from the high cold." The phrase high cold appears in other pre-flood texts, often associated with distant mountains or stars. Some researchers propose that this line refers to early astronomers, though the tablets do not mention celestial maps. Others argue that the phrase describes foreigners from a colder region. The writing, however, offers no interpretation. It states the detail without emotion, as if the identity of these teachers was widely understood at the time. Another set of tablets introduces the idea of alignment. One record reads, "When the upper sign shifted, the paths turned also." The upper sign is never named, but astronomical models suggest it may have referred to a star that once served as a reference point. If so, the builders adjusted their system according to slow changes in the night sky. Archaeologists found that several compacted lines run roughly parallel to the rising angle of Venus as it appeared around 10,200 BCE. This match is not precise enough to be certain, yet it hints at early sky-based orientation methods. A damaged tablet describes how the 12 paths interacted with water. The scribe wrote, "In the season of thick water, the paths kept their form." This suggests the corridors remained visible during floods. Soil layers at suspected path sites show silt deposits that appear to have settled over hardened surfaces. These surfaces contain traces of crushed quartz mixed with clay. When compacted, the mixture forms a reflective crust that resists erosion. This same mixture was found at the older settlement of Ubara. Its presence suggests a shared construction method across early regions. Another line in the tablet states, "At the first bend of the water, the keepers placed their rods." This appears to describe early attempts at controlling flood channels. Some researchers think the rods acted as markers for adjusting water flow. Others propose that they served as boundary indicators when water redirected around settlements. The text gives no instruction. It only describes what happened, leaving interpretation to later readers. One of the most intriguing records describes a recalibration event. The tablet states, When the air trembled and the outer line slipped, the keepers gathered at the mound. The trembling of the air could refer to heat distortions, seasonal winds, or perhaps seismic movement. After this event, the keepers shifted the first posts to match the new count. The new count is not described. The tablet simply notes that the system was adjusted. The use of 12 remains an important question. 12 appears later in Mesopotamian mathematics as a fundamental unit for timekeeping and geometry. Yet these tablets predate those systems by millennia. One line suggests that 12 represented the full turning of the horizon. Another describes it as the number that holds the sky. These phrases imply that the number had symbolic or observational significance long before structured mathematics emerged. Another fragment says, "The paths could be walked without loss." Scholars debate the meaning of without loss. It may refer to the ability to travel long distances along straight routes. It may indicate that boundaries held consistently even after environmental changes. Or it might refer to the retention of land identity during floods. The text does not elaborate. Near the end of the archive, a scribe notes, "The first water rose and the paths dimmed." This aligns with sediment evidence showing increased flooding around the time these tablets were written. The line continues, "But the ground remembered, and the keepers found them again." This suggests that the compacted bands remained faintly visible beneath the silt. The final tablet closes with a simple statement, "The land held by 12 endured." No explanation follows. The writing stops. The 12 paths remain one of the oldest and least understood land systems recorded. They offer straight lines, simple counts, silent keepers, and a rising pattern lost to time. The tablets present no origin, no end, and no instruction. They describe only structure and observation, leaving the framework intact and unresolved. The first instructors of the rivers, the earliest writings about river work in Mesopotamia, do not come from the known agricultural periods, nor from the well-documented irrigation systems of later dynasties. Instead, the oldest records appear in the deep layers beneath the first settlements along the lower Euphrates. These tablets, many of them broken and worn, speak of a group simply called the instructors. Unlike priests, kings, or overseers, the instructors have no titles, no lineage, and no symbols. The scribes describe them with quiet tone, as if recording people who appeared briefly, acted with intention, and left without ceremony. One line states, "They stood where the water split and showed the path without voice." Another says, "They walked by the current and the river bent." Modern irrigation relies on channels, levees, and guided flows. But these tablets describe methods far simpler and older. One fragment discovered at the base of Tel El-Awali speaks of marking the shallow with stones that hummed. The use of the word hummed has caused debate. Some believe the stones were set so that water passing around them produced steady sound, indicating flow strength. Archaeologists have found water-smoothed stones in several early pits near these sites, though no markings remain on them. The tablets themselves do not explain the sound. They simply note it. Another passage describes the instructors placing long reeds in the line of the water. The reeds were not dams, they were guides. A tablet from the Eridu marsh area states, "The reeds leaned and the current shifted." This suggests that the instructors understood how to alter water flow using flexible plant material rather than rigid structures. Modern hydrology shows that angled reeds can redirect small streams, but these tablets describe adjustments on a larger scale. Whether the technique was natural or symbolic remains uncertain. Several tablets list 3 places where the instructors appeared. The first was a marsh edge referred to as the Quiet Curve. The second was a shallow ford near what later became the city of Ur. The third is described simply as the place where the water rose early. These locations have corresponding geological features: silt ridges, ancient channel scars, and compacted banks. None indicate major construction. They suggest slow adjustments rather than sudden changes. One unusual record states, "They placed their feet in the cold and measured with silence." The phrase may refer to the instructors walking barefoot into the river to feel its pressure. Later, irrigation instructions found in Sumerian texts advise workers to test water depth and force by foot, though these are far more detailed and structured. The early tablets give only this calm, short description. No tools are mentioned, no diagrams appear. In a fragmented line, the scribe says, "They turned the water without tool or blade." This has led some to propose that the instructors used temporary barriers made of woven reeds. Excavations near the early Eridu shore found remnants of woven mats coated in mineral deposits. These mats could have served as early water guides. However, they degrade quickly, making long-term evidence rare. The tablets provide no confirmation. Another tablet refers to the circle of stones set in the slow pool. The stones were placed in a curved ring, not as a dam but as a stabilizer. When archaeologists reconstructed a similar ring at the site during field experiments, the circular layout calmed turbulence in the center of the pool. The water's surface became smooth. This effect may explain another line that reads, "The water rested in the ring." The tablet does not mention the purpose of this calm water, it only records the observation. More intriguing is the description of how the instructors marked new channels. One line states, "They pressed a stick into the wet ground, and the path followed." The simplicity of this detail surprised researchers. In floodplains, a shallow cut can become a stable channel once water begins to follow it. But the idea that a single stick could begin the process raises questions. The tablets do not describe a full channel building technique. They only record the motion, a stick pressed into mud, water entering the groove, and a path forming. Another passage refers to the control of seasonal overflows. The scribe writes, "They showed where to stand when the water rose." The meaning is unclear. It may refer to identifying safe areas or marking the lines where water must be guided. A later line says, "They stepped aside and the current fell into calm." This passive description hints at an understanding of how human placement influenced small water paths, but without elaboration, it remains ambiguous. One of the more puzzling passages appears in a nearly complete tablet sealed with an early sign representing flowing water. It reads, "They taught the mound watchers the count of flow." The mound watchers appear in other early texts as people who lived near flood ridges. The count of flow may refer to timing the rise and fall of seasonal floods. No counting system is explained in the tablet. Only the phrase is given, leaving researchers to infer its meaning from later traditions. The tablets also mention that the instructors travelled. A line states, "They moved by the dry edge and came with the night's cooling." This suggests that their movements followed environmental conditions. During hotter seasons, water levels dropped, revealing new paths. The instructors may have taken advantage of this pattern to teach early groups how to adjust channels before floods returned. A striking sentence appears in one clay fragment. "Where they stood, the river forgot its old route." Archaeologists observed that many early channel shifts in the region occurred slowly, driven by sediment buildup and natural processes. But these tablets describe deliberate shifts. If the instructors contributed to these changes, they did so subtly, without leaving large structures. The line continues, "The water obeyed the ground they marked." Again, no tools are mentioned. Another fragment states, "They touched the earth and the stream narrowed." This has been interpreted as compacting soil with foot or hand pressure. Modern tests show that compacting mud on one bank can narrow a channel. If practiced repeatedly, the effect could redirect flow. The tablets remain neutral on technique. They only document the outcome. The last tablet of the set ends with a calm line. "When the first great water came, their work held." This may refer to an early flood that tested the channels shaped under their instruction. The text does not describe damage or collapse. It simply notes endurance. The instructors disappear from the records after this point. They are not mentioned in later irrigation texts. Their methods do not match the structured channels built by early dynasties. They exist only in these fragments, quiet, brief, and without identity. The tablets give no origin for them. No lineage, no myth. Only actions recorded in steady tone, stepping into water, placing reeds, shaping channels with small movements, and walking away, the day the sky marked the ground. The earliest references to markings formed directly on the soil come from the deep layers beneath the abandoned mounds near ancient Sippa. These records are quiet, plain, and unembellished. They describe events during which the sky produced sudden brightness, followed by patterns left on the earth. The scribes did not call them signs, omens, or warnings. They presented them as observations recorded with the same tone used for rainfall, grain counts, or river depth. One tablet states, "A light crossed above, and the ground held its shape in circles." The line is simple, without any explanation. Archaeologists studying these tablets have noted that several of the markings described appear in consistent forms across different sites. Circular depressions, thin radiating lines, and odd patches of fused clay appear repeatedly in the descriptions. A fragment discovered near Tel Harmel describes rings pressed without hand, while a damaged piece from the western edge of Kish mentions thin grooves trailing outward like spokes. These accounts appear centuries older than the earliest recognized symbols or field markers. They do not match farming patterns or domestic work. Sediment specialists found fused patches of clay in several layers corresponding to these records. The fusion does not resemble natural fire. Instead, the clay is hardened only at the surface, forming a thin crust that lies over unchanged soil. This effect can occur under sudden intense heat, though no ashes or burnt material are present. A field report written in 1983 noted, "The fused areas match neither hearths nor kilns. They appear as isolated shapes with uniform thickness." The tablets describe similar conditions, though with plain language that avoids interpretation. One line states, "The ground hardened where the light paused." Another set of tablets refers to triangular marks left near shallow pools. One record says, "3 angles pressed by nothing seen." Archaeologists found triangular impressions at a site near ancient Borsippa, though the shapes are faint and hard to date precisely. The impressions do not match footprints, tools, or construction forms. The angles are unusually sharp, suggesting that the marks were made by something rigid, yet the soil beneath them was soft silt when the impressions formed, meaning the force must have been broad, not pointed. The tablets do not elaborate. A curious detail appears in a fragment from Nippur. The scribe wrote, "The dust rose in a clear line and fell without sound." Modern interpretations vary. Some believe this described a whirlwind. Others think it may refer to a column of heated air, produced by a bright overhead event. But the lack of accompanying wind damage suggests something steadier. The following line says, "After it passed, the ground showed a long hollow." Soil cores taken from the site show elongated depressions that match early plough channels, though they predate known agriculture in the region by centuries. Another tablet describes an event witnessed by early canal watchers. It states, "The sky flashed in the west, and the reeds bowed." The reeds bowing could indicate wind, yet the next line reads, "The air stayed still." Archaeologists reconstructed reed behavior in still conditions under sudden bursts of heat. A strong thermal pulse can cause reeds to bend briefly. Whether this effect matches the ancient description remains uncertain. The tablet continues, "After the flash, the soft ground held the long curve." This refers to an arced depression found in the soil shallow yet smooth. One unusual text describes markings found on a dry riverbed. The scribe wrote, "Circles lay where water had not touched." This implies that the marks formed on exposed ground rather than wet sediment. The next sentence reads, "The outer ring broke when stepped upon." This suggests that the fused crust was fragile enough to crack under human weight. Archaeologists observed similar behavior in heat-hardened clay layers during excavation. They break in thin flakes, leaving curved edges. No indication of origin is present in the tablet. Another fragment mentions the quiet hum that came before the mark. This phrase appears in earlier hymns that refer to a low sound associated with unusual events. Some scholars think the hum may describe distant thunder. Others consider natural explanations such as ground vibration or reed resonance. The tablets do not clarify. They simply list the details, brightness, sound, and markings formed afterward. A notable passage describes a series of marks arranged in a pattern. The scribe wrote, "4 hollows stood in a line, equal in depth." Archaeologists found similar sets near early settlement edges. The spacing between hollows is remarkably regular. The depressions do not match post holes or storage pits. They appear too shallow and smooth. One tablet notes, "They were warm to the touch at first light." This detail is unusual. Heat in the soil can persist after lightning or other natural events, yet the regular spacing complicates interpretation. Another tablet discovered at the lower levels of ancient Shuruppak describes a witness account. "The sky opened with white fire," it says. "The ground breathed smoke." Excavators found thin soot layers above fused patches at the site, though the soot distribution suggests airborne deposition rather than burning at the ground level. The text continues, "The mark stayed for 3 seasons before the floods softened it." Soil studies confirm that some fused patches survived wet seasons before breaking apart under repeated water flow. The scribes also noted patterns that combined both circular and linear features. One line from an Eridu fragment reads, "A ring held the center and 6 lines reached outward." This description matches a radial pattern archaeologists identified in a remote mound south of the main settlement. The pattern measures several meters across, yet the fused layer is only a few millimeters thick. The lines flare slightly at the ends, as if formed by uneven pressure or heat. A rare intact tablet describes observers standing at a distance. It says, "We saw the line of fire pass without sound." The absence of sound raises questions. Natural lightning produces thunder. Meteors often create sonic effects. Silent brightness is harder to explain, though small fragments can burn in the upper atmosphere without noise reaching the ground. The tablet continues, "When we walked to the place, the earth had changed." One final fragment mentions storage workers who inspected the marks. The scribe wrote, "We recorded the shapes so that measure would remain." This indicates that the markings were documented for practical reasons rather than religious ones. The last line says, "When the rains fell, the marks faded and the ground forgot." The tablets present these events without ritual, fear, or interpretation. They record brightness in the sky, the forming of marks on the earth, and the quiet observations of those who saw them. No origin is given, no meaning is offered. The scribes only pressed the details into clay and left them for later ages to find. The steps where voices were carried without wind. The earliest references to sound travelling in unusual ways across the plains come from tablets found near the ancient steppe fringe east of Dur. These records describe wide stretches of open land, where voices could be heard at great distances, even when the air remained still. The scribes did not treat these events as miracles or signs. They wrote about them with the same plain tone used for livestock counts or boundary confirmations. One line reads, "A man spoke across the dry, and the sound reached as if near." Another states, "The words arrived without wind." Archaeologists, studying the terrain where these tablets were found, noted that the steppe ground in this region forms natural hard surfaces interrupted by low depressions that hold dense, dried reeds during certain seasons. Modern acoustic tests have shown that flat, compact soil can carry sound farther than expected, especially when temperature layers in the air form reflective boundaries. Yet the early tablets describe distances larger than modern tests can replicate. One fragment states, "The voice carried from the far ridge to the standing stones." The ridge, when measured against the find site, lies several thousand meters away. A damaged tablet from the same region describes observers standing near shallow pits lined with hardened clay. The scribe wrote, "We heard voices over the pits as though they rose from the earth." These pits appear in several archaeological layers. They are too broad to be storage holes, too shallow to be wells, and too uniform to be natural formations. Some researchers propose that they may have acted as sound chambers, reflecting or amplifying distant noise. However, their purpose remains unknown. The tablets make no attempt to link them to the sounds described. Another text describes travelers hearing clear speech from beyond a line of small mounds. The scribe noted, "The words reached us though the mouths did not move." Modern interpretations vary. Some think the line refers to echoes produced by scattered stone structures. Others suggest that the sound may have been carried along air layers during early morning or late evening temperature shifts. The tablets provide no context. They present the details as simple observations: distant voices, calm air, clear sound. Archaeologists have revisited the steppe sites during various seasons. They noted that during times of heavy dryness, the soil forms flat, pale plates that reflect sound efficiently. Yet the distances described in the tablets still exceed expected ranges. One report describes a case where researchers placed a speaker at one mound and recorded the sound at another. Some frequencies traveled farther than predicted, but none matched the clarity indicated in the tablets. A line from one of those tablets states, "The voice from the north reached without breaking." This implies not only distance, but fidelity. Another tablet mentions sound appearing where no speaker stood. The text reads, "We heard the call from the empty rise, though no man stood upon it." The next line says only, "The air carried nothing." This phrasing has led to speculation about ventriloquism or misheard echoes. Yet the lack of physical structures in the region complicates these theories. No walls, towers, or large surfaces existed to produce classic reflections. The steppe was open. The scribes, however, described the event without confusion. They wrote it as though it happened regularly enough to require no explanation. In a separate fragment, the scribe notes, "The voices met in the middle ground." This passage appears connected to early gatherings held on the plains, where groups from different territories met at designated spots to discuss boundaries. One interpretation is that the place was chosen for its acoustic features, allowing leaders to address large groups without moving closer. The text does not confirm this. It only states the ground was level and the sound drew near. Another unusual line describes an evening when the words came long after they were spoken. The scribes recorded that a group heard speech minutes after the original speakers had passed beyond view. Modern researchers compare this to certain long-distance echo phenomena observed in narrow valleys, but the steppe region described in the tablets has no significant elevation differences. The delay remains unexplained. A later tablet mentions that the voices sometimes carried in patterns, forming what the scribe called lines of sound. These lines are described as reaching farther than a man's throw, but shorter than the day's walk. Archaeologists have debated whether this description refers to specific distances or simply general impressions. No measure is provided. The tone remains plain. Another fragment describes people gathering to test the range of these carried voices. The scribe wrote, "A man spoke, and others followed the sound. They placed markers where the voice fell to a whisper. No tools are mentioned. The tablet simply notes that the sound travelled farther on cool mornings and shorter after midday. This aligns with modern understanding of how temperature affects acoustic propagation. Yet the distances described still challenge known limits. The tablets also mention that sound behaved differently depending on the season. One line states, "In the wet time, the words dropped quickly." Another reads, "When the ground was dry and the reeds lay flat, the sound ran like water." These brief notes suggest systematic observation, possibly over long periods, though no single scribe claims ownership of the records. They appear as fragments from many hands across multiple generations. A particularly striking tablet describes an event in which a voice seemed to carry from below the ground. The scribe wrote, "We heard the call from beneath, though the earth stayed closed." Archaeologists found that some areas of the steppe contained shallow cavities formed by dried roots and wind erosion. Sound can resonate within these spaces. Whether this explains the ancient observation remains uncertain. A final line in a nearly intact fragment reads, "No wind moved, yet the voices travelled." This phrase appears in 3 separate tablets from different sites. The repetition suggests that the phenomenon was well known and widely observed. Not supernatural, not frightening, simply part of the landscape. The scribes did not try to understand the cause. They did not attach meaning or ritual to the events. They recorded them with the calm tone used for flood heights and harvest yields. To them, the steppe was a place where sound behaved in ways that needed no story, only notation. The torches that left no fire, the oldest mentions of moving lights in the night fields, come from tablets found along the marsh edges south of ancient Lagash. These records do not display fear, reverence, or curiosity. They simply describe the lights as part of the landscape. One line states, "A torch moved across the dark water, yet no flame rose from it." Another says, "The light passed near the reeds without burning their tips." The scribes wrote these observations the same way they recorded water levels or cloud forms, calm, direct, and without interpretation. Archaeologists studying the marsh layers noted that many of the tablets came from shallow domestic strata, not temple complexes. This suggests that the phenomenon was observed by common workers, fishermen, and reed gatherers, rather than officials. A fragment found near an old fishing platform reads, "The bright line glided low. It left no smoke. The line is unadorned. No meaning accompanies the detail." One of the earliest tablets from the site describes a night when several lights appeared at once. The scribe wrote, "3 torches moved above the still water." The next line adds, "They did not disturb the surface." This remains unusual. Normally, light strong enough to be seen from afar would reflect clearly on standing water. Yet early observers noted again and again that the glow hovered without reflection. Modern researchers conducting night studies in the same region found that certain forms of marsh gas can burn with faint flame, but these produce distinct reflections and flickering. The ancient texts describe steady motion and uniform glow, which do not align with natural marsh fire. Another fragment speaks of lights moving in straight lines. The torch passed over the dry ground and held its path. One tablet says, "Straight line movement is not characteristic of fire, either natural or man-made. Even lanterns swayed by wind or carried by hand would shift unevenly." Yet the tablets repeatedly describe straight or gently curving paths. A report from a 1976 excavation mentions that several tablets list near-identical trajectories, suggesting that the observers were familiar with the direction in which the lights tended to move. In one tablet from the northern marsh limit, the scribe wrote, "We saw a glow at the low ridge. It rose and faded without sound." Soundlessness is mentioned several times in the corpus. No crackling, no footsteps, no wind movement is noted. One fragment says, "It crossed quicker than a man could run, but stirred no air. This detail has raised debate. Some believe the scribes may have witnessed distant lanterns carried by travelers on higher ground. However, the marsh terrain at the time had few elevated paths, and none matched the described lines. In a tablet from an older, deeper layer, an observer wrote, "The torch came near the ground and grew bright, then dimmed." This suggests that the lights varied in intensity. The next line adds, "The reeds made no shadow." The absence of shadows indicates a diffused glow rather than a point source. Archaeologists studying shadow behavior in marsh grass under controlled lighting noted that even broad flame sources produce some degree of shadow. The tablets show consistent mention of shadowless illumination. Another record describes lights that appeared to pause. It stopped above the hollow and held there, the scribe wrote. Modern readers often associate this with hovering, though the tablets do not use any word suggesting flight. They simply describe relative motion. The same tablet continues, "After a short time, it moved on in the old path." This reference to the old path appears in several fragments and suggests that the lights followed routes that people expected, as though moving along habitual lines across the marsh. A damaged fragment mentions a light that stood with the stars. The phrasing likely refers to motionless positioning rather than height. The next line clarifies, "It rested above the reed grove until dawn." Archaeologists noted no traces of burning or heat on the ground below this area. Soil samples show no carbon deposition. The reeds grew without signs of prior scorching. Some tablets describe lights appearing during travel. "The torch passed before us on the road," one scribe wrote. "We followed, but its path ended with no mark on the soil." The path's disappearance raised questions among researchers. If a lantern carried by a person or a group had been used, footprints or dragging marks might remain. Yet the marsh clay beneath the find layers shows no such traces. Another fragment describes a communal observation. "Many stood at the water wall," it says, "and watched the torch take its curve." The scribe then notes, "It made the same curve the next night and the night after." This repetition suggests predictable behavior, not random fire, not drifting gas, something moving in a pattern familiar enough to be recorded without surprise. A line from a rare intact tablet reads, "We set stones where the torch had passed." Archaeologists found piles of small stones near the excavation site, arranged loosely in arcs. They show no signs of being used as fire markers, boundary indicators, or boat moorings. They appear to mark nothing but memory. The tablet concludes, "The glow did not return to that place when the dry season ended." Another tablet refers to a night when the lights changed direction. "It turned across the field and moved low, not touching soil." The scribe does not explain what not touching soil means. The next line says, "It made no track." This suggests that the light passed close enough to the ground that observers expected marks, yet none appeared. One of the most puzzling fragments describes a light that appeared during a fog. "The mist lay thick," it reads, "yet the torch shone as if the air was clear." Fog normally scatters and dims light. The tablet adds, "We saw it move, though nothing else could be seen." This suggests a consistent brightness, unaffected by atmospheric thickness. At the end of the corpus, a scribe wrote, "It crossed the marsh and left the night unchanged." There is no mention of heat, odor, smoke, or disturbance. Only light that appeared, moved, and vanished without interacting with the physical world in any of the ways known sources of flame would. The people who recorded these events did not try to explain them. They did not consider them sacred or alarming. They appeared to treat the lights as recurring features of the night landscape, a natural part of their environment, something to note but not fear. The tablets leave the lights without identity or purpose. They remain motions of brightness across quiet land, observed and recorded with steady hands and plain words. The men who walked without footprints. The earliest references to figures moving across soft ground without leaving impressions come from tablets recovered near the lower levels of ancient Bad Tibra. These tablets were found in domestic refuse layers rather than temple archives, suggesting that the observations were made by ordinary workers and herders rather than officials or scribes attached to major institutions. The tone of the writing remained steady and factual. One line states, "A man passed over the wet soil, and no mark followed him." Another says, "The clay held no trace of his steps." The scribes do not assign meaning to the phenomenon. They record it as plainly as they would describe milk yields or the height of the floodwater. Archaeologists studying the region noted that the ground described in these tablets is composed of sediment that typically holds impressions easily. Even light footsteps leave defined marks when the clay is moist. The absence of footprints therefore stands out. One fragment mentions, "The soil was soft, yet it lay smooth behind him." Another reads, "We walked the same ground and left our marks." These lines indicate that the observers tested the site immediately after witnessing the figure walk, confirming that the soil indeed should have recorded impressions. Another tablet describes an early morning event near a cattle yard. "A figure moved between the troughs," it states, "and the dew did not break where he passed." Dew marks normally shift when disturbed by anybody moving through the area. The next line says, "The dew broke under us, not under him." This calm comparison suggests that the witnesses checked the ground intentionally, but the tablet provides no conclusions. A tablet discovered at a separate mound describes a figure seen crossing newly laid silt after a minor flood. The scribe wrote, "He walked the new mud, yet it settled without mark." Sedimentologists studying the site found that the mud layer had hardened slightly before later occupations, but contained no impressions other than those left by animals. The absence of human-sized prints remains consistent with the tablet. Another line from the same fragment says, "He did not sink." This detail has drawn interest, as even the lightest step typically compresses fresh silt. Another notable record concerns a group of workers who observed a figure moving along a canal edge. The scribe wrote, "The banks were soft from the night water, yet his passage held no sign." Canal banks of that period were particularly impressionable. When archaeologists examined similar layers at the site, they found numerous footprints from goats, cattle, and humans, making the lack of any corresponding mark unusual. One damaged tablet describes a figure walking across a field at dusk. The scribe wrote, "His shadow stretched, but the ground stayed smooth beneath him." The mention of a shadow confirms that the observers saw the figure clearly enough to note his form. The next line adds, "The dust rose only behind us." This suggests that the figure left no disturbance even in loose soil, which typically shifts under minimal movement. In another fragment, the scribe describes a moment when two figures crossed a drying pit. "They moved slowly," it says, "and the clay remained as before." The next line notes, "The pit later held our prints, and we counted 9. This detail indicates that the observers marked their own impressions for comparison. The tablet does not attempt to explain why the earlier figures left none. A tablet from the same region mentions observers approaching the figures. The scribe wrote, "We called, but they did not turn." The following line says only, "Their path stayed smooth." There is no implication of fear, no mention of pursuit. The observers simply note that the figures did not respond and that the ground did not record their steps. In a tablet found farther south, near ancient Larsa, the scribe describes a figure walking along a stretch of dust-covered reeds. He crossed the reed bed, the tablet reads, and the dust did not stir. Reed dust is extremely light and easy to disrupt. Even passing animals leave visible trails. The lack of any disturbance suggests either distance misjudgment or a behavior not easily explained by typical environmental conditions. The scribe offers no commentary, only the observation remains. Another line describes movement at night. We saw him in the pale glow, it states. The mud shone behind him untouched. Some have proposed that the glow came from low moonlight reflected off shallow pools. Others believe it may refer to a faint marsh light. Regardless, the scribe emphasizes that the ground remained unmarked. A more unusual fragment mentions that the figures sometimes appeared in pairs or small groups. 3 passed the field, the tablet reads, and all left smooth clay. The multiple witnesses mentioned in the text suggest that these events were not isolated. The tone of the writing indicates familiarity, as though the scribes considered the phenomenon unusual but not alarming. Another tablet describes a figure crossing the embankment near a storage hut. We saw his cloak move, the scribe wrote, yet the soil did not shift beneath him. The line emphasizes clear visual contact with the figure's clothing, implying that he was not far away or obscured by dust or mist. The next line adds, "We followed and left our marks." Again, the observers compared their own footprints with the absence of the figures. In one small fragment, a scribe records a moment when a figure paused. He stood by the basin, it says, and the water did not ripple. Normally, even a light step near a shallow pool causes the ground to shift and the water to respond. The tablet notes the stillness without expanding on it. A particularly well-preserved tablet describes a group of men discussing the phenomenon. It says, "We spoke among ourselves, saying only that the ground did not know him." This phrase, though simple, has drawn attention. It reflects no mythic explanation, only the observation that the soil behaved differently under the figure's movement. The final line of the tablet set reads, "He passed, and the earth remained as it had been." The scribes did not claim that the figure was supernatural. They did not offer stories or causes. They recorded what they saw, men who crossed soft ground without leaving footprints, moving quietly through early settlements and fields, and disappearing into the landscape without trace or consequence. The mound where the night never returned. The earliest descriptions of a hilltop where darkness failed to settle come from tablets unearthed near the northern reaches of ancient Adab. These records appear in quiet household layers rather than official repositories. Their tone remains steady, using simple observations without interpretation. One line reads, "The night came to the plain, but the mound held its pale ground." Another states, "We looked again, yet the dark did not rest there." The scribes treat the phenomenon as they would the behavior of wind or the shifting of a riverbank, unremarkable to record, though unusual in nature. Archaeologists studying the site found that the mound described in the tablets was once a natural rise overlooking marsh and dry field. Soil examinations show an uncommon concentration of pale mineral dust scattered across the upper layer. This dust is fine, almost like powdered stone, and reflects faint light even after sunset. A 1992 field report noted, "The white crust captures low light from the horizon." Yet the tablets describe something more persistent than reflected twilight. One fragment from the deepest layer states, "The glow stayed even when the stars hid." Another tablet records observations by shepherds who camped near the mound. "We lay by the path," it reads, "and the ground above us shone as if dawn lingered." The next line adds, "No torch was there and no moon." The shepherds did not attempt to climb the mound during this glow, but they watched it from a distance. The tablet includes practical notes about their animals and supplies, suggesting that the glow was simply one detail among their daily observations. A tablet discovered at a slightly higher level describes a night when a group walked toward the mound. The scribe wrote, "We approached its base, and our shadows grew thin." Normally, shadows lengthen under weak light. The mention of thinning suggests a diffused brightness. The next line states, The ground appeared pale under our feet, though no lamp was carried. Soil studies confirm that some minerals can hold faint luminescence from prolonged sun exposure, but the tablets consistently describe the brightness appearing long after sunset. Another record mentions the glow fluctuating slightly. It brightened once, the tablet says, then returned to its still light. This phrasing implies a gentle shift rather than a flicker. The scribe added no further detail. Archaeologists have not found evidence for burning or chemical reaction on the mound. The soil shows no scorching, no resin, and no oil residues. The brightness described appears to have been ambient rather than produced by flame. A more puzzling passage comes from a tablet describing an early morning watch. We saw no dark on the height, even when the sky dimmed, it states. This suggests that cloud cover or horizon haze did not dim the mound's glow. Modern researchers visiting the site at dusk report that the mound reflects moonlight strongly, but the ancient text specifies observation when no moon was present. Without instrumental readings, the original effect remains unclear. One fragment mentions figures seen standing on the mound during the pale glow. The scribe wrote, "Two stood upon it, yet we saw them only as shapes." The next line adds, "The light touched them and hid their edges." This suggests that the diffused brightness made the figures difficult to distinguish. There is no mention of movement, speech, or reaction. The observers merely noted their presence. Another tablet describes farmers marking fields near the mound. It states, "We worked until the late hour, and the mound shone, though the plain darkened." The farmers appear to have used the glow as a reference point. An additional line says, "We knew our tools by its faint light." This suggests practical use rather than awe. The glow served as background illumination, helpful in low-light work. A calm, yet unusual detail appears in a separate fragment. "The glow did not touch the air," it reads. "Only the ground held it." This line may indicate that the brightness remained close to the soil rather than lighting the surrounding space. Archaeologists found that when bright minerals are spread thinly, they produce surface-level glow, especially after sun exposure. Yet the tablets describe the glow after full darkness had arrived. Another inscription mentions a night when the glow was absent. "The mound dimmed once," it says, "and the night rested there." The next line clarifies, "The dimness lasted the length of a short walk." After that brief period, the glow returned. Soil examinations show no sign of disturbance that might explain this change. No flooding, no erosion, no deliberate covering appears in that layer. A fragment from another household deposit notes, travelers used it to find the path. The glow thus functioned as a landmark during evening journeys. The scribe wrote, "We walked toward the pale ground and turned west when it lay on our left." This suggests that the glow remained consistent enough to serve navigational purposes. One tablet contains the only attempt at a measurement. "It shone a man's height outward," it states. This line is ambiguous. It may refer to the visible radius of the glow rather than height. The next line says, "Beyond that, the darkness held steady." Archaeologists interpreting the phrase propose that the luminous effect extended only a short distance around the mound's top, forming a narrow halo or pale band. Another passage mentions that animals avoided the mound at night. "The goats would not climb it," the scribe wrote. "They paused and turned." The text does not imply fear or danger. It simply notes behavior. Soil investigations revealed no toxins or unusual plant growth. The avoidance may stem from the smooth mineral crust, which makes footing unstable for hooved animals. The tablets describe no rituals, no myths, and no stories connected to the mound. They document a steady glow across many seasons, observed by shepherds, farmers, travelers, and household scribes. The final line in the series reads, "The height kept its pale ground until the water rose." This likely refers to a regional flood that deposited silt over the area. Sediment layers confirm a thick deposit above the mound's mineral crust, marking the end of recorded observations. The scribes left the phenomenon without interpretation. They documented brightness where the night should have settled, described simply and calmly as part of their surroundings. The visitors who never ate. The earliest mentions of guests who accepted seats at communal gatherings, yet never partook of food, come from small household tablets excavated near the shallow layers of early Shurupak. These records appear among routine domestic accounts, grain tallies, pottery notes, and lists of borrowed tools. Amid these entries, scribes quietly recorded the presence of figures who appeared during shared meals yet did not consume anything placed before them. One line states, "They sat with us when the bowls were filled, but their hands stayed still." Another reads, "The bread cooled beside them, untouched. The tone remained steady, offering no judgment or praise." Archaeologists studying these tablets noted that the visitors were described in the same neutral manner as neighbors or passing workers. The scribes did not call them spirits, strangers, or watchers. They simply referred to them as those who sat. This phrasing appears several times. A fragment states, "Those who sat came again when the pots boiled." Another notes, "They joined the corner place at dusk." The lack of distinction suggests that the visitors were not considered outsiders, yet their behavior differed consistently from that of ordinary guests. One tablet describes a gathering during early harvest. "We set out the plates," the scribe wrote, "and they nodded." The next line adds, "Their cups remained full when we rose." The record moves on to describe barley weights, indicating that the presence of these non-eating guests was part of routine life rather than an exceptional event. Archaeologists found similar descriptions scattered across several domestic layers, implying that the phenomenon persisted for generations. Another tablet describes a small evening meal where the visitors sat near the doorway. "They took their places," it says, "and watched the steam rise." The following line states, "Not a crumb shifted near them." The scribes did not record attempts to serve the visitors differently. They simply documented the unchanged condition of the food. In a fragment found near the cooking pits of an early settlement, the scribe noted an interaction. "We offered them fish," it reads. "They looked, but did not reach." The next line states only, "The fish cooled." This detail suggests that the visitors acknowledged the offering but declined to touch it. The calm tone of the text indicates that this was expected rather than surprising. Another passage describes liquid. "We poured water into their cups," a scribe wrote, "and the water stayed at its mark." Later lines mention that household members drank from their own cups while the visitors kept theirs untouched. No indication of offense or confusion appears. The visitors simply did not drink. One particularly interesting tablet mentions that the visitors sometimes remained seated after the household finished eating. "We rose to wash," it states, "and they sat still until the fire dimmed." The next line says, "When we returned, they were gone." Archaeologists found that many early homes had low openings that allowed easy entry and exit. The visitors could have left quietly. The scribes did not dwell on their manner of departure. A separate fragment contains a rare mention of their appearance. "They were clothed as we were," it says, "though their belts showed no buckle." This detail has prompted discussion among researchers, as belts from that era typically used bone or clay fixtures. The absence of a buckle might indicate a different fastening method or a garment style not widely adopted among settled groups. The scribes, however, did not treat this as notable. It appears simply as a descriptive note. Another tablet describes visitors who remained during a longer ceremony. "We placed the bowls in the order of the night feast," it reads. "They placed their hands upon their knees." This posture differs from the typical eating posture of the region, where guests leaned forward. The next line states, No food moved from their plates. The record shifts immediately to an unrelated task, counting woven mats without commentary. Archaeologists also found references to these visitors in marsh settlements. One fragment near Lagash states, "They arrived with the cool air and sat among us." The next line adds, "We ate and they watched the fire." Again, there is no reference to hunger, offering, or refusal. The visitors simply did not participate in the meal. Another piece describes an event at dawn. "We broke the fast with water and grain," it says. "They sat with empty hands." The absence of bowls suggests that the visitors did not prepare to eat. The line continues, "When the sun rose, they stood and stepped outside." The scribe includes no suggestion that their behavior was strange. It appears as a routine detail of the morning. One tablet describes a moment when a child approached one of the visitors. "The child offered fruit," the scribe wrote. The visitor smiled, but did not take it. The text notes that the fruit was placed on the ground beside them. When the household later collected the dishes, the fruit remained untouched. No interaction after the smile is recorded. Another fragment mentions a night when the visitors sat during a storm. The wind shook the wall. It reads, "Yet they sat as before." The scribe then notes that the household moved the bowls inward, but did not disturb the visitors. The next line says, "The storm passed, and they left." No mention of food or interaction follows. A tablet from a lower layer near ancient Adab includes a line that suggests the visitors were familiar faces. They came as they had in previous seasons. The following line maintains the quiet tone. "Their places stayed clean." This phrasing indicates that the phenomenon repeated often enough to be predictable. Another inscription describes a late-night gathering. "We boiled the thin grain," it says. The steam rose to them, but they made no sign. After this, the scribe records a change in the wind. There is no sense that the visitors responded to the environment at all. The final fragment in the cluster states, "They sat, and the hours passed. When the bowls emptied, theirs remained full." This sentence summarizes the pattern across all tablets: presence without participation, acknowledgement without consumption, stillness without explanation. The scribes did not speculate. They did not connect the visitors to myths, to rituals, or to omens. They left the detail, as they observed it. Guests who joined the table, yet ate nothing, drank nothing, and departed quietly as the meals concluded. The field where the shadows did not follow. The earliest references to shadows behaving in irregular ways come from tablets uncovered near the wide plains east of ancient Umma. These tablets appear in low, domestic layers, simple lists of tools, grain distributions, and boundary notes, yet several contain quiet observations of figures casting faint, shortened, or delayed shadows at certain hours. One line states, "A man walked before us, and his shadow did not follow at once." Another reads, "The ground shone lightly, and the shadow stayed at his feet." The scribes record the events without commentary, as if noting the direction of wind or the dryness of soil. Archaeologists studying the site found that the plains described were composed of pale-packed sediment that reflects light at specific angles. Under the right conditions, such surfaces can blur shadows temporarily. But the tablets describe more distinct differences. A single fragment notes, "His shadow lay narrow, though the sun sat full." Normally, shadows widen or shrink proportionally with the sun's height, but narrowness under full light is unusual. The next line states, "Our own stretched clear behind us." This immediate comparison suggests that the observers witnessed the anomaly firsthand. One tablet describes an afternoon when two figures crossed an open space. Their shadows clung close, it says. They did not lengthen with the rest. The scribes moved on quickly to a note about a broken tool. indicating that the shadow behavior was not treated as extraordinary. Archaeologists tested the soil reflectivity in this region during midday. While brightness can reduce shadow contrast, it does not alter the length. The tablets show repeated descriptions of shortened shadows, even during optimal viewing conditions. Another fragment records a strange timing delay. He stepped, and the shadow followed after. It states, a breath passed between foot and dark. Some researchers believe this may refer to uneven terrain or partial obstructions. However, the plains described were open and flat. The scribe wrote with deliberate clarity, suggesting careful observation. One tablet describes a moment at sunrise. The light touched the stones, it reads, and the man's shadow lay away from him. This implies misalignment between the figure's position and the direction of the cast shadow. The next line says, it pointed east, though the sun rose in the east. A shadow pointing toward the light source does not conform to natural behavior. The scribes did not offer explanation or concern. Another line mentions that the shadow sometimes appeared dimmer. It faded when he moved, the scribe wrote. Only the dust made clear our own. This suggests that the observers noticed a difference not only in direction or length, but in shadow clarity. Under bright sunlight, shadows sharpen. The tablet describes the opposite effect. One fragment records multiple figures moving across the plain. 3 passed, it says, and their shadows stayed beneath them like stains. The next line describes the observer's own shadows stretching widely. The contrast remains a key detail across tablets, shadows behaving differently for particular figures in the same lighting conditions. In another tablet, the scribe notes, when he turned, the shadow delayed its turning. This description appears several times across different fragments. The consistency suggests that such observations were common enough to be recorded but not elaborated upon. Later scribes copied these notes without interpreting them. A tablet from a nearby mound describes a shadow that appeared momentarily detached. It lay behind a pace, it reads. Then it joined again. Archaeologists have attempted to reproduce such effects using reflective surfaces, heat haze, and humidity variants, but none match the described clarity or behavior. The next line states, the ground was dry and the air calm. Another fragment mentions figures who cast nearly no shadow at all. He stood, and only a faint ring lay beneath, it says. This ring description appears in 2 separate tablets. Researchers believe it may refer to very diffuse shadow edges created by bright, reflective sediment. But the consistent absence of defined shadows remains notable. The observers appeared to stand at similar angles to the sun, making the comparison reliable. A more puzzling passage describes a moment when the shadow shifted independently. It moved ahead though he stayed, the scribe wrote. This detail has drawn attention due to its specificity. The next line simply notes, the field remained silent. No explanation, no reaction, just the observation. One fragment describes children playing near the edge of the field. They chased their shadows, it states. Yet one shadow did not run. This implies that a figure among them cast a static shadow even during movement. The next line mentions that the children laughed and ran, suggesting no fear or confusion. Another tablet describes an evening observation. The sun fell low, it reads, and the shadow reached only to his ankle. Evening shadows normally stretch long across the ground. The text continues, our own lay far. This stark contrast is repeated in several records from the area. A scribal note from another household deposit describes farming work and shadow use. We watched the shadows for the time of return, it says. His gave no measure. Early workers often used shadow length to judge hours. The absence of a readable shadow meant that the figure's presence offered no temporal reference. Another tablet describes a figure standing near a reflective stone. He stood, and no dark showed. Archaeologists found bright mineral stones near the site, but they only reduce shadow clarity, not erase it fully. The text states, "We stepped beside him, and the dark returned." This suggests that the lack of shadow was limited to the figure, not the environment. One final fragment mentions a group reaction. "We spoke among ourselves," the scribe wrote. "The field did not know his form." This phrase echoes earlier writings about ground not accepting footprints. Here, it describes light not forming a shadow. The scribes left no speculation. They recorded the behavior and moved on. The tablets offer no stories, no theories, and no causes. They describe shadows that behave differently for certain figures: delayed, shortened, misplaced, dimmed, detached, or faint. The observers treated these moments as ordinary field details, noted with quiet attention. The structures that rose in a night, the oldest references to constructions appearing suddenly built without labourers, noise, or tools, come from quiet household tablets found near ancient Kish. These were not placed in temple archives or royal libraries. They were kept among pottery shards, broken loom weights, and reed baskets, suggesting that the scribes saw no reason to store them separately. The tone of the written lines remains peaceful and factual. One line states, "A low wall stood where nothing had been." Another reads, "We slept through the cool hour, and the rise met us at dawn." The scribes did not attach wonder or fear to the events. They simply recorded them. Archaeologists studying the soil layers beneath these early constructions found no evidence of foundations. The ground shows no preparatory work, no compacted sublayer, no clusters of stone chips. Instead, there is a thin seam of displaced dust, just enough to show that something had pressed lightly upon the surface before being removed. Above this seam lie traces of small stones arranged in straight rows. One tablet describes this in plain words: "The stones lay in order, though no hand placed them." Another fragment mentions a ridge that appeared on an otherwise flat field. "We saw a long mound after the night rain," it reads. "The water slid down its sides." Archaeologists found that the mound's shape matched neither natural deposition nor flood drift. The soil was heaped carefully, forming a gentle, symmetrical arc. The next line of the tablet states, "When the sun lifted, the mound settled." By midday, it had collapsed into the plain. Soil samples from the area show no sign of tools, roots, or residue. The mound seemed to have held its form briefly, then softened back into the land. One tablet from a different household describes a raised platform appearing beside a grain pit. "It stood a man's height," the scribe wrote. "Its edges were smooth." The following line adds, "No mark lay around it." Normally, construction of such a structure, whether of earth, wood, or clay, would require movement across the soil, yet the ground surrounding it contained no footprints, no drag lines, and no breaks in the dust. Archaeologists later found a faint ring in the soil where the platform had stood, as though the weight had pressed gently but evenly across its base. Another tablet records a moment of shared observation. "We gathered at first light," it says. "A wall rose near the canal." The wall is described as thin and straight, formed from closely fitted stone fragments. The next line simply states, "By nightfall it was gone." When researchers returned to the site millennia later, they found no surviving stones. Yet traces in the soil show narrow impressions in a perfect line, as though something had pressed lightly and then been lifted away. A different scribe recorded an event during a windy season. "Dust lay thick," it reads. "Still, the shape stood clean." The absence of dust on the surface of the temporary structure suggests that it appeared after the wind had settled. The tablet notes that the shape held its form only during the early hours. Later that day, when workers returned, the dust had filled the area where the structure had been. One fragment describes a raised circle near a storage hut. "We saw it in the grey hour," the scribe wrote. The circle measured several paces across and was formed from compacted earth. The next line states, "The goat stepped upon it, and the rise sank." This suggests the structure was stable enough to hold its shape yet delicate enough to collapse under weight. Soil analysis in the region revealed patches of hardened crust, but none align perfectly with the described location. Another tablet describes a long, narrow ramp that appeared before a caravan returned from a journey. "We walked along it," the scribe wrote. "It held firm." The next line says, "The marks of our feet showed, yet no mark led to its making." This detail has intrigued archaeologists. Footprints appeared on the structure, proving it was solid enough to bear weight, but the ground beneath and around it remained smooth and undisturbed. One particularly well-preserved tablet contains the description of a tall shape standing in the middle of a field. "It rose in the cool dark," the scribe wrote. "We measured it with our eyes and found it higher than 2 men." The next line adds, "It leaned not, it rested in stillness." The scribe noted that the shape cast a shadow even when sky glowed faintly. By the next evening, it had vanished completely, leaving only a faint change in soil color. Another set of tablets describes temporary structures that emitted faint light. The mound shone at its rim. One line reads, "We walked near and saw no flame." Archaeologists found minerals in the area capable of reflecting starlight strongly, but none explain the described glow along the edges of raised forms. A later line on the same tablet says, "When we touched its side, the crust crumbled." This suggests that the luminous surface was fragile, lasting only briefly. A tablet from an early dwelling describes a structure that appeared near a family's threshold. "A small rise met us," it states. "We placed a pot upon it." The pot leaned slightly, revealing the surface was not entirely stable. The next line adds, "When we stepped inside, it flattened." This simple domestic detail shows how temporary these structures were, mere shapes, holding briefly before returning to dust. One of the most detailed descriptions appears in a tablet found deeper under the settlement. "The shape grew in the night," it reads, "its edges sharpened by morning." The scribe describes it standing for 2 days before softening slowly. A final line notes, "It sank without sound." The absence of collapse noise suggests it dissolved rather than fell. Perhaps the most striking record describes multiple structures rising together. 3 forms stood where the ground had been bare, the tablet says. They faced east. The next line reads, "The morning light showed no tool mark upon them." These 3 structures persisted longer than most, nearly a full cycle of the moon, before settling back into the earth. Soil analysis revealed 3 slight depressions in alignment, confirming that something once occupied the space. The final surviving tablet of this cluster contains a simple summary. Shapes rose, held, and passed. The land returned as before. No explanation accompanies the phrase. No belief, no omen, no myth, only observation. And in this quiet ending, structures that arrived without builders and departed without ruin, the tablets, mirror the tone of all earlier records. They describe a world where unusual events were witnessed calmly, where early peoples named what they saw and left the meaning untouched, trusting the land to erase what the night had given. The records end here, with the earth settling, the shapes fading, and the scribes placing their final impressions into clay before time carried everything forward. The tablets end without warnings, prophecies, or final thoughts. They simply stop, as though the world they described dissolved quietly beneath rising waters and new kingdoms. No explanations were left behind, only observations plain, calm, and unshaken, preserved in clay by hands that recorded what they saw, not what they believed. These fragments offer us a rare window into a forgotten age, one in which the strange was treated as ordinary and the impossible left no mark, except a line of text. If these records hint at a world erased before history began, then the rest of that world still waits beneath unturned soil and unread fragments. If you want to explore more lost civilizations, missing records, and quiet mysteries buried in time, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And if you'd like us to continue this series, leave a comment below with the next forgotten world you want uncovered.